Welcome everyone to this webinar from the Open Group today, which I'm pleased to say is being led by Dr. Ali Asanjani from IBM and Dikal Kumar from AP Hunters. Today we're looking at SOA. Before I hand over to our speakers, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping issues to keep the event moving forward smoothly. We encourage you to submit questions during the event. That is one of the main objectives of bringing these events to you. There are two ways to submit questions. You can either write your question in text chat facility or you can write it in the text QA facility. In either cases, can I encourage you to address your questions to all analysts, all attendees. That way everyone gets to see all the questions that are being submitted. And address the questions at the end of the event. You'll also be interested to know that this whole event, both audio and visually, is being recorded. If you have to leave the event early for any reason, or you experience any local technical difficulties, then the event will be available to watch in the future from tomorrow. You'll all get an email that will contain the relevant URL where you can access that recording. So I think that covers the housekeeping issues. So that's it from me. So perhaps I can hand over to you, Nikhil, to start the presentation.
Thank you. So I will start off with a quick overview of what we expect to come, what you will learn from this presentation. This presentation is an overview of the Open Group's reference architecture, and it kind of will also look at the role of SOA in the cloud. It also covers how we leverage the SOA RA to create and evolve service-oriented architectures, which includes road mapping, use SOA RA, which is now a formal Open Group standard and is in the process of becoming one across the ISO domain 2, and OSIM, which is the service-oriented maturity model, which other SOA from the Open Group. We will also go through a series of steps, or we'll provide an overview of a sequence of steps we can use to realize and create solution architectures, and briefly look at success factors. We'll look at examples in the future. So, Lee, do you want to take this slide?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nikhil. In the context of building solutions and in the context of trying to make solutions meet business requirements and meet business needs, which has been the whole rail of what we as architects and software engineers have been trying to achieve. We are taking SOA, service-oriented architecture, as a set of capabilities or services that collectively, in terms of the entire service portfolio, help fulfill the business needs and the fact that we need to share a common SOA platform based on which we can build our solution. Based on that kind of a basis, we provide an SOA that allows us to bind business and IT together in a fabric of common technology and common understanding by having a linkage between the IT domain and business architecture through enterprise architecture via SOA. And these capabilities generally help us address business agility, having a robust set of services and capabilities, and map business and IT together. Utilize, so that has been the general message, but until we reference architecture, the process of actually building out the solution has been pretty elusive and pretty much a cottage industry. People are building very good SOA solutions, but doing pretty much one-offs. They are not consistent necessarily across vendors or consistent across clients or the vendor. You want to have a product perspective. There are multiple products there. How do you combine all these perspectives together and form a consistent foundation? So we reference our architecture, provides you with a set of capabilities and architectural building blocks that will help define that realization, that common platform on which you can fulfill the business needs. And it allows us to link with not SOA, but the offshoots of SOA, such as the services that the cloud provides and the adoption of cloud in an evolutionary and transformational fashion, phasing it into a map. And we utilize another one of the Open Group standards, which is the OGIM model, the Open Group Service Integration Maturity Model, to help move the organization forward in terms of its adoption and evolution. So, Nikhil, if we could advance, please, and maybe you want to take the next one.
Tenet for me. Organizations are adopting or evolving SOA and cloud solutions. As enterprise architects or IT thought leaders, we face this all the time. And what SOA does is it provides a vendor-independent approach so that we don't get mired in religious wars about product or protocols, mainframe versus DID or .NET versus J2E, etc. It provides a holistic common point of reference for all the stakeholders. And, as Ali mentioned, it serves across the IT realization cycle, so to speak. It can see the same terminology, the same verbiage, and understand the same things. It provides a framework for conformance and solution architecture derivation. We talk about capabilities, and we'll talk a little bit more about capabilities and architectural blocks in the next few minutes. And it is scalable. So you can test from the level of an ecosystem and get down to the level of individual solution architectures. And that's something we try and build from scratch again and again. As enterprise architects, we do that all the time. Well, that time and is not very productive. But here we've spent time across multiple organizations and come out with a standard which all of us can agree on and move forward with. And that's a big piece of leverage for enterprise architects to leverage in their internal organizations. Vendors have effective for it too, because this gives them a framework against which they can build solutions, they can leverage for compliance and differentiation. System integrators use it to carry out implementations and develop cloud and SOA architectures. Standards bodies, as the HT&G, for example, are already leveraging it to define the future state, or rather their future state solution architectures across our industry architectures, across the different of business. In particular, the SOA RA provides the ability to adapt, evolve, and transform SOA and cloud solutions. It is a vehicle for agility and uses the cost of RA definition, which is the thing you'll find is the big I would almost put it as the impedance for adoption of enterprise architectures and solution architectures. So if you look at it, what are the key steps involved in using it? You need to assess an existing architecture. Think about it almost as the use case there. You have a checklist of layers, capabilities, architectural building blocks to validate against. Answers the question, how can I assess whether I have the right things in place? You can use to design a new or extend an existing architecture. And so answer the question, what are the things I need to build, design to my requirements? As architects, we often face the question, how do we incorporate the cloud? And it plays a role in providing the building blocks around which cloud solutions can be architected. As you see in the link down there, there's the link to the actual physical SOA RA standard, which you can all download whenever you have time, if you have the interest. So, Ali, do you want to take a slide?
Certainly. So this iconic representation of the layered view of the SOA reference architecture is important because it gives us a high-level perspective around which we can build all the details. So this is a representation, an iconic representation of the SOA reference architecture. The reason I'm characterizing it as such is that pictorial representations have their benefits. As you try to explain it to different people, you'll find that there's a lot of benefits to this view. There may be limitations as well, as all representations have. Here we have 5 main layers in the SOA reference architecture. Start from your running systems, your operational systems that are running in your host operating environment. And you get a snapshot of that in time and expand it out, you get these other layers essentially. You get a bunch of components, service components, that are realizing, they could be .NET components, EJB components, so on and so forth. Potentially realize, at least some of them realize, services that are then exposed at the services layer. And this layer is sort of a mediation ground between the provider and the consumer. You can look at the provider view from the bottom up, from operational systems, service components, and services up, and the consumer view from the consumer, business process, and services layer downwards. The meeting ground is at the services layer. Note that these horizontal layers are cross-cutting with 4 vertical layers, if you will. Those vertical layers are superimposed upon each other. They're stacked, if you will. You see integration above quality of service, above information, above governance. And all of the horizontal layers cross-cut all of those 4 layers. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're using the RA. So there's an intersection between services, integration, quality of service, information, and so on for the other layers. Now, if we combine services, orchestrate them, and combine them in some shape or form, in terms of orchestration or choreography, into business processes, into more coarse-grained services, you get the business process layer. We can string together and wire together these services, and they be accessed by a consumer layer. Now, the consumer layer can go directly to the services, can go to the business process layer. And of course, the services arise by a combination of service components or corresponding operational systems, wherein the application servers, the databases, the legacy systems are all running. The integrator provides a layer of indirection and mediation between everything. It could be at a very, very primitive level, let's say level 4 of OSIM. It could be point-to-point. As we mature from 4 towards 5, we can get more and more into enterprise service bus kind of scenario, and that would be the home for the enterprise service bus resides, in the integration layer. Whatever mechanism you utilize to integrate services together would be in that domain. The service layer is then responsible for maintaining, ensuring, monitoring, and managing the quality of service that the service provides. The information layer provides the backdrop for all the aspects of data and business intelligence, schemas, etc., that are necessary for the realization of services, all the way down to the database. And the governance layer itself would be the home, for example, for the registry and repository, or registries and repositories that are needed to realize services. Effectively, these 9 layers form the logical boundaries and logical partitions and groupings around which you'll see we're going to provide further levels of granularity. So if we may go to the next slide, please. As described is summarized in this particular slide for your future reference.
if I interject, Ali, here's a point I think we want to make clear is there's a separation between runtime versus physical, or rather logical versus physical. And if we were to go back to this slide, you would see there are 8 layers reflect logical components. The operational systems layer is kind of the home where all the physical components run in real time. All the logical elements are instantiated. Ali, do you continue slide, or should we move to the next one?
That's a really good point. And so the importance of this aspect of logical versus physical is that we often develop application architectures based on a logical view. We ultimately have to map them and realize them on a architecture. So that distinction is an important one. Yes. Okay. The relationship between capabilities, architectural building blocks, and layers. Nikhil, do you want to take this, please?
So we can think about layers are logical grouping of ABBs, that's architectural building blocks, and capabilities. Capabilities as what your SOA needs to support, the requirements of the SOA. So if business capabilities defined, which that, for example, we need to be able to write a message from a smart grid application at a particular speed and transformer goes down, then that helps us determine what are the capabilities that the SOA needs to support. And from that, we can pick the corresponding architectural building blocks. So there's a relationship between these architectural building blocks and capabilities. And if we group these ABBs and capabilities together, they end up with the SOA. So that's an important mechanism for us to decompose and map business needs and business drivers to actual capabilities that you need in realizing solution application architectures. Do you have any comments you want to add to this, Ali? Or
yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Do you want to slide, Ali?
No, go ahead. I'll take the next one.
So the cloud architectures are extensions of SOAs. Now that's an important thing. Even if you were to look at the NIST model, you would see that one of the attributes of a cloud are that it is service-based. And I actually have a technical reference model on the next slide, which illustrates what typical perspective for the cloud and how cloud RA standards can be based on how cloud functions, which are driven consumer provider model, can be used and derived from the SOA and how they can be mapped to the SOA. And that helps us to kind of refine and leverage this extensively. And in fact, the upcoming cloud array standard is going to be based on and is significantly derived from the SOA. If you look, Ali, I'll go through this slide too, kind of because I kind of authored this long ago. So anyway, the basic point over here is that if you were to look at a cloud action, there's a consumer and a provider, regulator, and it's a very simple perspective. And the reason I'm bringing it in is that if you look at service, this is really what's there in the service too. And the compelling reason why when we look at cloud solutions, especially as enterprise architects, you can start realizing that you've got a daisy chain services together, and there's this direct correlation. And more and more important in cloud solutions is the role of the regulator, even from a perspective of if you're a provider or a consumer, because you need your data and your SLA to be monitored and auditable. Do you want to go with the matrix, or do you want me to go ahead with the matrix, Ali?
Go ahead with the matrix, and I'll chime in.
Sure. So if you were to look at the capabilities of the cloud, or the characteristics as we've talked about the cloud, against the deployment models which traditionally exist in the context of the cloud, and the service models which are being which have evolved text to the cloud. So you really determine a particular cell, where does my particular problem fall, and what are the capabilities I need on combination of these two, attribute sets, whether it's a deployment, whether it's a private cloud, for example, and whether it's a business process as a service. And if you look at that combination, you can actually derive what are the core capabilities which are going to be of import to you. And you can now determine what layers and what components of the SOA array fit in over here. You can add further, determine what non-functional requirements are there, and we'll look at that in the SOA array meta model in a few minutes. And you can take the array meta model to further refine and determine your individual solution architecture. Let's look at some of these characteristics from the three different perspectives we had: consumer, provider, and regulator. Going to move forward, we can look at these later. Ali and I are also planning to hold a future webinar to workshop to actually walk through certain scenarios and actually show a particular pair of examples which we can actually execute against. And so that's when we will really go into details on this particular slide in the future. Do you want to test?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the usage of the SOA array, usage context is going to be important.
Sorry, I'm just Simon here. Ali, can you try and speak up a little bit? Your volume is dropping a bit low.
Is it better now?
That's better. Thank you.
So to utilize the SOA array, we realize that as a logical solution architecture or enterprise architecture standard, we need to instantiate it. In other words, we need to concrete either solution architecture or some kind of an intermediary industry architecture that will ultimately be instantiated with concrete elements in it. So to that point, this business capabilities that we need to align with and that are actionable, and the SOA capabilities that map to the reference architecture and are quantifiable, and then the architectural building blocks, which the OPA provides a normative and prescriptive set of these, and then map them to the solution architecture constraints ultimately in terms of solution building blocks. So let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. In order to do this, in order to instantiate this, let's go look at what sits behind the array, the meta model, conceptual model behind the SOA array. This basically shows that we have a set of layers, a number of layers, that actively contain a number of architectural building blocks. And those architectural building blocks can be composite, and they interact with one another. So there are interactions between these architectural building blocks. If at it from a slightly different perspective, there are a set of capabilities that are then realized and correspond to these architectural building blocks. You can think of the capabilities as a set of requirements and the architectural building block as a means of reaching those requirements. These layers essentially are going to have a number of architectural building blocks / capabilities associated with them. But these building blocks, these architectural building blocks, will often have non-functional requirements associated with them as well. Non-functional requirements will partake in your designation of certain KPIs, key performance indicators, that actively will influence your architectural decisions. These architectural decisions about architectural building blocks, and so on. So they may be at various levels of granularity. Ultimately, they're going to be enabling technologies, these layers, that will influence and impact your architectural decisions. The enabling technologies realize these architectural building blocks. And of course, to concoct your solution, you have a set of options for these architectural building blocks. Once you select an option, through these architectural decisions, you will then result in an instantiation of those architectural building blocks. So looking at very simplistically, each of the layers in your SOA RA would contain a number of architectural building blocks, and a number of capabilities would be associated with those layers. So if you're trying to assess, then you would go through and assess based on your capabilities. Imagine a spreadsheet with all the architectural building blocks listed there and the capabilities for each layer, and then conduct your architectural assessments against those. Alternatively, in the other use case that we just described, you're trying to design an SOA RA. You then go through and identify which ones of those architectural building blocks are needed, based on the NFRs and KPIs and the requirements that you have, capabilities you need to actually function along. You can continue with the next.
Yeah, so it's just my finger.
No, that's perfect. Good idea. So in order to instantiate the SOA RA, look at some key performance indicators and non-functional requirements and business capabilities that collectively form requirements. They help constrain the reference architecture, help us look at all the options and arrive at the architectural decisions that are a selection of the options based on the constraints. This helps us determine the required capabilities, architectural building blocks, and solution building blocks that we need for our solution architecture. So move on.
Right, so I'll just interject for a second. So if you look at this is a very important slide from my perspective, and I think from our perspective in general, and that is whenever we are dealing, let us say, with a legacy scenario, and you have a number of different applications, and you rationalize things, then the ability to determine what is the actual solution using this constraint-based model is powerful. This series of steps, so to speak, that we have on this slide is very simple, very elegant, which we can just rapidly apply. And the availability of the capabilities and the actual building blocks and their definitions is, helps architects as well as, solution implementers quickly come to solutions rather than indulge in a lot of relatively leverage the time better would be the way I would couch it. Common use cases in this scenario are establishing enterprise SOAs, design solution architectures, assessing an existing solution architecture, implementing and selecting product platforms, and building an industry reference architecture. Through a couple of these use cases to kind of give an idea of how we recommend they get called use the SOA RA. Head over now. Ali, do you want to take this slide?
Yeah. First use among them are the establishment of an enterprise SOA. This requires a portfolio of your capabilities. What are the business capabilities that are required? What corresponding technical capabilities that will be used to realize those business capabilities? So now the question would be, what part of the SOA RA do I need to accomplish this? And map these capabilities that are required to the SOA RA capabilities that you have as a list. Through your layers, you have the capabilities, and then based on the different context in which you are functioning, the KPIs, the NFRs, and the constraints of your project, layer, you go through and identify the architectural building blocks. You check off the architectural building blocks you require and capture the specific constraints that are related to those architectural building blocks so that you make product mapping and realization decisions from multiple vendors as you move forward. Nikhil, would you add to that?
I think you did that fine. Actually, it was have you take 1, 2.
Okay. So in the design of solution architectures as well, we now more granular. And for example, in the case of providing mobile self-service, you have a very specific problem domain. You want to get a little bit more granular. What are the different options you have? You may have various back-end and J2E, for example, provider modules. You identify the key performance indicators and non-functional requirements, for example, a 5-second response time with multi-factor authentication, and then work on the architectural decisions that are related to it. For example, the selection of integration adapters, the routing and mediation mechanisms you want to use. And so you would utilize the SOA array and them to the solution capabilities you have, capture your constraints against those building blocks, and then you can perform the mapping to the solution building blocks which realize your solution architecture, i.e. the product mappings and capabilities that exist within actual products and solutions. So we've gone a step down from the enterprise capabilities into solution architectures with this use case.
And to add to that, we could go a step up also. If you were talking about ecosystems or industry reference architectures, you really leverage the same model, or your business capabilities would be dealing with industry level or ecosystem, like quasi-governmental level, organizational level characteristics.
Right.
So the third use case is assessment of a solution or SOA array, which I keep stating that you need to know the capabilities and constraints. So it's important to understand what are your business capabilities when you're assessing a solution. What are we always say we need to know our requirements, but capability mapping is an important aspect of applying architectures and reference architectures. And make sure you have a clear understanding of your technical capabilities. Map them to those SOA array capabilities. That's your rubric that you're measuring things against. That's where you're taking your decisions. Now your layers. Can you see discrepancies? Do you see things missing? Do you see mappings to a roadmap? And we'll take a look at a couple of slides to see what happens. But when you're looking at it now for a particular solution and when you're assessing it, you're saying, two right business capabilities addressed here are mapping to the RA, and because the RA provides a complete collection of architectural building blocks and relationships between them to a certain extent at least, we can determine what should be there if it's missing. And the gapping process becomes much simpler. Did you have any comment on the assessment, or are we okay?
So I think at this point, if you agree, let's briefly open the floor for some questions around the scenarios that we just described, and see if it jives with what our colleagues here are seeing. Points of clarity you would like to engage in on, and things you'd like us to elaborate on, if that's possible. So I'd like to open the floor for questions on these particular use cases we just discussed.
So I think you're asking if anyone would like to submit any questions specifically about what you've just been discussing, yes?
Yes. And either the chat or voice.
Vinod Maladkar asks, what is it? TO? That's the open group. Sorry, that's an acronym for the open group.
Right. Have Ajay provide any guidelines on assessing or identifying business capabilities? More times than not, can't articulate them. So, in terms of the SOA reference architecture itself, we're not providing specific guidance. The how-to from a method perspective is not captured in the SOA RA per se. That would be more in terms of the the TOGAF ADM architecture development method, and other methods such as the SOMA method, oriented modeling and architecture, or other methods that have come after it, which essentially provide the guidelines on how we identify business capabilities and services. But we don't necessarily provide guidelines in terms of the SOA-RA per se.
To add to that, Ajay, basically the way we are doing this is in the context of SOA. Capabilities are defined in the SOA-RA. In the context of business capabilities, from the perspective of the standards coming out from the open group, the project called SOA Business Technology, which will help map the business capabilities to the SOA-RA. It's less, I would say, to provide determinations of, as Ali articulated, there are different methodologies and different organizations have different criteria to determine, or tests, if you want to call it, to determine which business capabilities are of importance to them. What the SOA for Business Technology will do is it will provide an articulation of what are business capabilities and how they can be leveraged to connect into the SOA RA. And the SOA RA really is the one place you're looking for all the technical capabilities you need to support those business capabilities.
That's great. I also have some questions in the QA section, Ali and Nikhil. Do you want me to just go through those?
Sure.
Okay, well, we've got quite a number here, so I'll just start my way through them. A question here from Mike is asking, does each organisation have to maintain its own repositories for services, or is it accepted that service access can cross enterprise boundaries, wide access, etc.?
Nikhil, I'll take that, and then if you want,
sure,
if you'd like that. So generally speaking, Mike, it would be ideal if we could have that level of trust. I think there are no technical impediments to it. I think there are more organizational or security or perceived impediments to that kind of an ecosystem level integration or repository-based kind of perspective. Where do you store my services? It tends to be that organizations want to keep services inside their own registry and repository and circles of trust. So they have, just as you would imagine, for a certain business line, they would only expose, if you start with a specific business line within an organization, they have access to everything. As they start going enterprise-wide, maybe they restrict the access, not necessarily for security purposes, but because of relevance, for example. They go to their business partners, they restrict access yet again, and then they move into their customers for restriction of access, and then the ecosystem would be the least number of services exposed. It's perceivable that you could access these repositories, companies, and have repositories that provide a brokerage kind of service between enterprises in the ecosystem. And that's the direction that is a slow direction, but it's moving in that direction. But I personally have seen the tendency of organizations to want to house their services in own organizations and have those levels of trust. That's just a sort of an experience. Nikhil, you want to add to this?
Sure, I have a few points there. So one, I think, as Ali articulated, there are ecosystems developing would be the right way to couch it because of the growing adoption of the cloud. So, quite governmental or, I would almost put like organizational supply chain or organizational chain scenarios where different organizations communicate and commit and develop trust relationships. So the federation has started, and as Ali articulated, there is a evolving acceptance of the possibility of the concept of a cloud broker, really. There's another aspect to this, and there's trust where there's a consumer viewpoint. Trust tends to be a combination of context as well as credentials provided. And so the trust model gets extended to kind of address credentials that different consumers, if you provide more credentials, for example, your bank allows you to see different data. This applies to services in the context of services require different levels of governance and different levels of quality of service constraints as they evolve from one circle of trust to the other. So you have a service which is exposed out of the context of the enterprise. There are different SLA constraints in terms of response. There are different SLA constraints in terms of security. So that's my additional comment to that question. Simon, are these questions all being captured? And could you put them into the chat or something so that we could all see them?
Yep, I can copy them over. We have some other questions here.
Sure.
Let me just bring two together. We've got a question here about ABB. One from Gonzalo, one from Mike. So let me read them both out and see if we can handle them together. So the question is from asking, is ABB based in one technology or is it generic? Second question which relates to this is, could you draw a distinction between an ABB and SBB in terms of specific capabilities, say our CRM capability, systems management, monitoring capability in an enterprise? And he says, doesn't SBB have to include specific products? Can you handle those two, guys?
Yeah. I'll part of the question if I may. And then you ABB to SBB map.
Sure. Okay? There we go. So tag team it.
Remember the question correctly. The architectural building blocks are product and platform agnostic. They are, for example, you may have in the integration layer, you may have mediation, routing, transformation, capabilities that have associated with them architectural building blocks, components, if you will, that provide those capabilities for you. So they would generally be agnostic to products. But then when you do select a product based on your constraints and functional and non-functional requirements that you'd like to meet, general capabilities that the product would need to have, you would then say, okay, I'm going to check off, yes, I need routing, yes, I need mediation, I need really fast transformation capabilities. So then you would say, if I wanted to go to some vendor, maybe I need not a regular ESP, but maybe an appliance, because I have fast XML translation, transcoding, transformation capabilities I need. And so it would help you guide towards the solution mapping, the instantiation, towards the actual solution building block from the architectural building block, which is a segue to you, Nikhil.
Right. So simply the solution building block is the stage where we have gone to defining killer solution architecture. So for example, let's say we picked as an ABB mediation. It has a certain set of capabilities. We went through our process and we really determined that our mediation component has to be highly available, flexible, and we have an architectural constraint. It has to work with, say, .NET, J2E, and, say, some other environments. Based on those constraints, we can determine and make a particular solution selection. It may, because of the maturity level of the organization, that's going to be a collection of point-to-point services without the mediation which normally would like to see. At that point, you can determine, okay, we're going to use HTTP as a platform. I'm trying to be facetious because these are very simple solutions. But here you're coming out with the definition of a solution building block. Now you have constraints required to constraints which help you determine the monitoring and security requirements, and that help you further refine your solution building block to say, look, we need to have SOA-based transport, we need to have a particular fault model, we need a particular security non-repudiation model, and we need to have a certain speed of transport. These different elements which will now start determining what your solution is, and the solution building block is actually that component we actually start utilizing in the operational runtime environment, in the operational systems layer. We have moved from essentially a logical component, which is the AB, to a specific component, which is the solution building block. Just have as an FYI, the standard in particular addresses this question right front in an FAQ format or an FAQ fashion or document, so that everybody gets a quick understanding of the different aspects of the SOA array.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question to follow. This is from, how does an enterprise or enterprise architect or application architect know what services or service components are available for building applications within his or her enterprise? Is this access administered worldwide?
Ali, you want me to grab it?
You read the beginning part of the question again? I apologize. I didn't quite get the beginning.
Of course I can. How does an enterprise or enterprise architect or application architect know what services or service components are available for building applications within his/her enterprise? As well as on how is this access administrated worldwide?
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll be happy to take that. So back to the question around registries and repositories. Visibility in terms of, so first of all, you got to find and identify those services, which back to the very earlier question. So once you've identified them and they're sitting in a repository and registry and been validated over governance, that these are indeed the ones that should be there for the enterprise or for different circles of trust or for different circles of applicability. They're sitting there. Now, to your point, how do we access them? Well, the mechanism of access would be they would have to be sitting in circles of trust and access within a registry and repository. I mean, they'd be on a wiki. I have, clients who are at this levels of maturity. They go anywhere from a spreadsheet to a wiki to. So those are the primitive forms, and you can get away with a few initial services, and you can get away with the early days of adoption and putting your toe in the water and understanding what the landscape looks like. But as you get more serious, obviously in the context that you were asking the question, which is a enterprise architect's perspective, it definitely needs to be a registry and repository that you have access to worldwide. If you have a global enterprise, the access of that global enterprise in a federated set of registries and repositories is going to be paramount to your gaining visibility and access, so that you actually leverage services for reuse and let them for orchestration potentially in a BPM. So I'll put there, and sort of in the direction of the question that you were, or the answer that you were looking for. If you kindly give us feedback via chat or voice, that would be appreciated.
Thank you, Nikhil. I've actually pasted a question from the QA section into the chat facility. It will be the question right at the end of the list of the chat. I've done because it's a really complex question, and I'm going to read it, but you may want to read it yourself. So this is the question. The question is: considering the architecture continuum and the solution continuum in a specific enterprise, is there a continuing divergence between organisation and the outside world due to the channeling of the architecture through the, and he says, FF common, sys industry, org specific? As I say, make it more sensitive if you can read it, but it is in the chat facility. But is that something you can help with?
This is Gil. So, Simon, I'd like to get a little bit of clarity on what he means by FF common, sim industry, organization specific. He's referring to the steps that we have shown early on. The answer is I would think of it as divergence, but more as specification. So, to illustrate, we have at a high level a set of architectural building blocks and capabilities defined in the SOA array. From an information architecture perspective, for example, we may have a schema specification, say the art schema for retail. We get art schema for retail, and that's at an industry-specific level, and it defines a lot of components in a verb fashion which we can use across the entire enterprise. Now, if we take that down to the next level, which is on a specific organizational level, that's where you take it further and say, in my context as an organization, what elements of that schema are relevant. For example, we may have a subset of the total type set as well as a subset of the total ontology being leveraged from the schema internally. So it's not necessarily a divergence, I would argue, for a good, usable, and effective service set. There may actually be a convergence, only a specialization or a subsetting of. Now, your constraints, the divergence, but the process being followed doesn't draw that divergence. It may be specific NFRs or KPIs or capabilities that your individual organization requires, either because of the line of business it's in or because of the manner in which it differentiates itself from other organizations. I don't know, Simon, could you ask the person who submitted the question?
Yeah, we've got, Mike has kindly provided us a little bit more clarity. So with regards to the end part of that question, he's clarified, he's referred to foundation framework, sys industry, org-specific architecture.
So it refers to us because we talked foundationally, the SOA RA would be the foundational framework. And an example that I just talked about, the ARS is a retail industry specification standards body, as a schema specification, and then I have an illustrative example about a particular organization scenario. From my perspective, again, it doesn't necessarily lead to a divergence. It actually leads to a specialization, if you want to call it that.
Thank you. Ali, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think we're fine.
Great. Well, I'm noticing the time, so we're coming close to the top of the hour, so that's the hour done. It would appear that we've gone through the final questions on the QA and the chat facility. Nikhil and Ali, are there any final points you'd like to make?
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to go over that slide. Go ahead.
Well, couple of things. One of the things is, we have, I think, about 4 minutes left, right, Simon? That's correct. Right. So we may go over a couple of these slides to kind of illustrate how we do road mapping. And so, and I would like to let the attendees know that we are planning through the open group to have another seminar in the future, which will actually take a couple of scenarios and kind of walk through them at a much lower level so that people get an understanding of how to physically actually apply the SOA. What this was, you could kind of think about it as an introduction, while the next session would be more of a tutorial. I don't know if you want to use the word workshop, but a web-based workshop is the way I would couch it. And all right, do you want to start with this, and then I can chime in on the next slide?
Thank you. So generally, the important idea here is that organizations move through various levels of maturity as they adopt different aspects of SOA. So I remember I was talking to someone who said that, you know, we did get an SOA because we didn't get an enterprise service bus, or we didn't get an SOA because we never got a PM, a choreography kind of engine, a BPM engine or BL engine. So really the response to those kinds of expectations is more education along the lines of you start with 4 and you get some base services going, and you move towards the right, you will get various levels of additional maturity going as you adopt different products and capabilities. But from an SOA perspective, we need to realize that increasing architectural building blocks and layers will be adopted as we move from level 4 of maturity onwards. That's very key to understand, that you're not going to be adopting SOA lock, stock, and barrel by saying, I'm going to adopt everything under the sun, by adopting a specific technology and so on. It's important to start from you have pain points and move towards an increased adoption based on an initial assessment of an OS assessment, and then a final state assessment where you want to be, and then identify the architectural building blocks via the SOA that will get you there to that level, higher level of maturity that you would like to achieve in the application domain or architecture domain. I'll leave it at that and pass it on back to you, Nikhil.
Sure. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go down to the next slide. And this is actually an example of kind of, or rather a process view of how you can leverage and define roadmaps. Against business drivers, you determine your technical capabilities. And keep in mind that in practice, these capabilities and these both technical and business are going to evolve over time. And the roadmap, you're going to define these shots against particular points in time and them to the OCM dimensions to help determine what you would need to be able to do. And then to finish the roadmap, you kind of phase the delivery process, and your governance framework, the process governance, needs to be able to enable you to balance the roadmap on a regular interval. In particular, if you were applying the SOA to achieve higher maturity levels, where you are at the current point in time, you map it to where you are in terms of maturity, and then you determine where you are at the next stage based on the meta model that we've talked about. One thing we've seen very useful in communicating with stakeholders about SOA and about the RA and about the process of road mapping is to use a day-in-the-life model to provide context to all the stakeholders. Now, this is not prescribed in the RA, and different organizations and methodologies have different ways of expressing the service life cycle. And you can pick and define whichever mechanism you want, map it to your delivery methodology, so if it's Scrum or it's Fall or whatever. But the concepts are important. And what does it mean to the stakeholder? What does it mean to the business? What does it mean to a developer? What does it mean to an enterprise architect for each of these particular stages for a service, a day in the life of that service, is a very powerful mechanism to communicate what it means in delivering services and service-oriented architectures. Ali, take this slide, or do we want to I think we're actually over.
Just very quickly, basically, so what you would do is you would you realize that each level of maturity will use a different combination of layers and architectural building blocks to realize a given target level of maturity. So you may start at, for example, defining a certain set of simple services, realizing them. You may then add the integration layer with an enterprise service bus. You may add the business processes and choreograph your services to get to level 5. So it's essential to have that roadmap, do an assessment of where you are, where you want to be, your target state, and then pick and choose the architectural building blocks from the SOA RA that is needed to realize that end state. That's really the main import of what we are communicating with you guys today.
At this point, we will actually, draw clear to this particular presentation and lit up. Feel free to communicate. You have our contact information. You have the open group information, and we also, look forward to. We provide the opportunity for you guys to also engage in the next webinar, which we're also hoping to hold, which would cover the aspects of how the examples which I shot past, which I blew by. So that webinar would really say, how do we build a roadmap? Take a particular, organization. How do we actually build a solution architecture? And walk through, case study, if you want to call it that. Any questions or anything that you want to add, Ali or Simon or the audience?
We've had a number of inquiries with regards to how people can get a copy of the slide deck. What would be the most efficient way to make them available if you are happy to do that?
I think my answer to that, Simon, is really we could socialize it and provide it to the open group, or they can contact us directly at, our email information is available on the deck itself, or it's right here. I don't know, Simon, do we provide the contact information for Ali and I? And I don't know if we have any thoughts on that.
If anyone would like to get a copy of the slide deck, you will all get a copy of my email address, because you'll be getting an email with regards to the recording. So you'll get my email address, Simon Lofthouse. If you want a copy of the slide deck, please send an email to me, and I'm sure that Nikhil and Natalie will have your request, and we can get you those slides. When I think that's probably the most efficient way. And I'm sure that when Chris returns, he will be able to put a copy of the slide deck up on the SOA website. Okay, Nikhil, if that's if you're happy, if you've got final comments.
I think we're good. Very much, everyone, for participating and listening.
Thank you. Take care.
And with that, I'd like to thank Nikhil and Ali. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this event. And on that, I think I'll close it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Take care.